started a new chapter today on mass media and the political agenda. And in class, we started with the old days, and the old days was newspaper. Now, I'm fully aware that newspapers are a thing of the past, but back in the day, political parties created and subsidized various newspapers. Now, circulation was small, newspapers were fairly expensive, and advertisers were few. And newspapers circulated among political and commercial elites who would pay. So that's the old days. And then from there, we see a rise of the popular press, and changes in society and technology made the press self-supporting and able to reach mass readership. And a main thing was it was inexpensive, that the everyday person could afford a newspaper. And that was because of the high-speed press that made newspapers very quickly. Telegraph with that Morse code, beep, 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 beep. Okay, that was the first instant communication. We see the Associated Press, the AP, it's still around, and they gave objective reporting, and then it was spun by whoever picked that up. And urbanization, people living in cities allowed large numbers to support a paper. So papers became really popular, easy to buy, all that good stuff. And two early titans from this world emerge, Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. And you've probably heard of Joseph Pulitzer because of the Pulitzer Prize, the prize awarded to the best writer for that particular year. And William Randolph Hearst, very wealthy man that started buying a ton of media outlets and controlling the message that went to the nation. And from Hearst papers, we see this rise of yellow journalism. And yellow journalism is fairly simple. If it bleeds, it leads. Get the people's attention, hook them in, and they'll buy your paper or watch your show, whatever the case may be, based on time. Now, the evidence of how strong the media power was both Hearst and Pulitzer encouraged American involvement in the Spanish-American War. And we did fight that war. So the fact that a journalistic outlet can have that outcome is showing the power of the media. And that was a long time ago, but the media is only increasing in its power. On the other side of that, we see the muckrakers. Okay, so the muckrakers are people who take a stab at people in power. These are individual writers. Through investigative reportings, they muck the rake, the nasty stuff in society, and they illuminate it to let people know about it. And a real famous one, Ida Tarbell, was probably the most famous for her day. She went after John D. Rockefeller, who was the richest man in America. So muckrakers, in addition to Hearst and Pulitzer, that's the lay of the land during this era. And then we see this transition from print to electronic mass media. So the radio was invented in the 1920s. You can see a picture of one of the first radios. Now, with a radio, a politician could address voters directly. And, the President FDR with his fireside chats, you might have remembered. So mass media could reach people very quickly, and people who weren't particularly literate. They could hear it even if they weren't proficient readers. So it's a very powerful medium. And then we have the three network years. When I was a kid, I was brought up in the three network years before cable. And during these years, the vast majority of Americans got their news from these sources. Trust in government was pretty high because the three networks presented pretty similar stories. They were researched and vetted and pretty objectively delivered. As a matter of fact, there was a man named Walter Cronkite. You can ask your grandparents. They know Walter Cronkite. And he was deemed the most trusted man in America. In this day and age, if a news reporter is called that, I will be quite shocked because people are a lot more skeptical. But when Cronkite said something, they took it to the bank. Now, this was pre-cable, pre-internet, those years. And then we have the national media. Now, the national media at this point has a couple different means of getting out there. Number one is a wire service like Reuters. And that's where a lot of people get their news. A news event happens, Reuters gives it to them, and it spreads out. National magazines, they're dying, just like newspapers, but some of them still have some clout, although it is declining. Television networks, now there's a wide range. If you're watching, NBC versus Fox News versus CNN versus C-SPAN, all on television, a very different uh, political message in those. And newspapers with national readership. There's a few left, in particular the New York Times. So these are the outlets. But let's be honest with ourselves. The world of today is a social media world. Some of your screens have all of these apps. So this is just a quick cross section of some of the apps, but bear in mind, it's not a uniform thing like the big 3 years were when you had, Walter Cronkite. If any of these buttons, if I were to say, okay, where do you get your news from? Each button is probably going to give you a different outcome, a different perspective. I think that's safe to say. So the world of today is very competitive. It's becoming more so. Now in America, we have these media outlets that are privately owned. Now in Europe, that's not the case. So think about this. In America, with privately owned media, you have a few individuals dictating the message going out to a nation. Okay. So this orientation to local market, they're trying to win over local markets. And there are some limits by the FCC, but what's difficult about the internet, the FCC very well might not be able to stop misinformation from certain sites. Now, a legitimate vetted news source, yeah, the FCC can step in. Okay. So without any change, or with any change, excuse me, there's upsides and downsides. So the social media world, is no exception. So there's really no conclusive research on the consequences of this rise. But there's a recent access of politicians to electronic media. I would venture to say, you look at all 535 members of Congress, I would guess they have a social media account. Now, narrowcasting is using algorithms and it targets segmented audiences, okay? And we're going to see this in a documentary coming up, okay? But the narrowcasting, it's a very narrow amount of news you're getting. And politicians seek visuals even after they're elected. So even after they're elected, they're still using social media. Now, the upside is it's a free market. I mean, everybody is free to present their views, and voters and political activists can talk to each other. It's amazing. If I've seen recent gatherings of people in the last 20 years, they were organized around social media. So to say it's good or bad, like anything, it's a bit of both. Depends how you look at it. Now, the roles that the national media play, they can be a gatekeeper. What is news for how long? On a very small level, I do that in class every morning with my board. I have to figure out, okay, what am I going to present to you? What am I not? Scorekeeper, who's winning, who's losing. You see that in, political races, that sort of thing. And then you have watchdog groups, investigate and expose scandals. Probably Woodward and Bernstein's Watergate is the most well known. But even on the local news, recently Karen Drew was talking about the abuses of the mortuary industry in Detroit. She was being a watchdog. So we still see that. Now, we also live in a world of trial balloons and shorter sound bites. So trial balloons are intentional news leaks, leaks you want to get out for a political reason. That's becoming more common. And then sound bites. Unfortunately, sound bites in 1968, people had an attention of 40 seconds. In 2004, that number dropped to 8 seconds. So these sound bites are really making or breaking politicians and people's political views in a very short amount of time. Obviously, 8 seconds is not enough to get the full story, but that's the way it is right now. Now, there are some rules governing the media, and rules of newspaper versus electronic media are different. Newspapers are almost entirely free from government regulation, First Amendment stuff. Radio and television stations must be licensed and regulated. Now, reporters want to keep the right of their sources to be confidential. Now, most people do not want that. They want their sources to be known. But this is a debate for another day. But if a source says, I'll tell you, but I can't ruin my life. Let's say I had some privileged information about somebody, but I said, I don't want to lose my job or, lose my life, my putting food on my kid's table. I understand where they're coming from. Now, the Supreme Court does allow government to compel reporters to divulge information in court if it bears on a crime, and police search of newspaper offices were upheld in situations like that. And again, the FCC licensing, it's 7 years for radio, 5 for television. It has to serve community needs. I know that's vague. And public service, other aspects can be regulated. Now, there have been some recent movements to deregulate. This Act of 1996 permits one company to own as many as 8 stations. So the result, there's a few large companies now own most of the big market radio stations. A bit of an oligarchy, if you will. Now, in terms of the effects on politics, again, it's inconclusive because people have selective attention, they have mental tune out, and products can be sold better than candidates. That we know. So the power of social media to have you buy stuff is much higher than getting you to win you over to vote for them. And, because of this, newspaper endorsements used to be really important for politicians. It's less so. And now these press corps are gaining in power. And here's an example of the press corps. So there are some tools to fight back. Okay. So with various press officers, you can maybe find a little more accurate news. Now, press releases, canned news, they can control what gets out there. You can bypass the national press for local news. That's another thing. And presidential rewards and punishments for reporters based on their stories. That's problematic, okay? Because if you're only writing a story to ingratiate yourself, it kind of goes against what a journalist is. Okay, so sorry I'm running a little long here, but at the end of this is the assignment we did in class, and the questions are news stories slanted? And I'm going to ask you to find 3 articles on the same topic. Find one that's right-leaning, one that's in the middle, one that's left-leaning, and answer that question for yourself. Letter B, why do we have so many news leaks? Provide a recent example of a news leak that's been influential. How was it leaked and what effect did it have on the world? Now, looking at sensationalism in the media, find an example of a news story that has transcended news with its sensationalism, and you would say it's crossed the line into propaganda. And then letter D, government constraints on journalists. What should be done to journalists that spread falsehoods and misinformation? What's the legal line between free speech and a violation of the First Amendment? Okay, so based upon that PowerPoint, if you can apply it to these questions, that'll be all well and good. And I appreciate you watching.